Thank you for staying where you were. And welcome to this session. Trump versus his own Justice Department is at least, I suppose, one part of what we'll be talking about. I'm Trevor Morrison. I'm the dean at NYU School of Law, and I'm thrilled to have here on the stage Jeh Johnson, former Secretary of Homeland Security, also a former General Counsel. Thank you. Jeh was also General Counsel of the Defense Department, and we worked together during that time when I was in the White House counsel's office, also at the beginning of the Obama administration, and Preet Bharara as well. We're thrilled to have you.
And you forgot the most important thing. And former Assistant United States Attorney
in the Southern District of New York.
Indeed, right. Yes. Preet, too, is a former assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of New York, but spent rather more time as the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, and is now a distinguished scholar in residence at NYU Law and podcaster extraordinaire. Preet, thanks for joining us.
Sure.
So one of the challenges with putting together a panel on any topic within shouting distance of this topic is that between the point 6 months ago when we decided this seemed like a good idea, and now it seems like several lifetimes worth of events have happened that could cause us to retitle the session and to refocus it. But we're going to try at least to begin with the most recent events and then to take up some of the broader themes. And for that, we need only turn to yesterday and the announcement by the press secretary in the White House that the president had signed a written determination in late July revoking the security clearance of John Brennan, the former director of the CIA. John is known to all of us and is certainly well known in the intelligence community. And that is not literally unprecedented action, but certainly an extraordinary action, and maybe provides an opportunity to talk a little bit about what we think that reflects about the relationship between this president and the institutions responsible for maintaining the rule of law and national security within the United States government. So, Jeh, what do you think?
Wow, big question. First, today, I can't help but reflect on something that happened to me a couple years ago. When I was in office, when you're Secretary of Homeland Security, there's not a lot of fun. Occasionally, however, I get to do things like throw out a first pitch at a baseball game or an embassy party, an embassy dinner. 3 years ago, French embassy. My wife, Susan, who's back there somewhere, and we go to this embassy dinner, and I walk in, and there's Justice Scalia, there's Justice Kennedy, there are a few U.S. senators, and I'm thinking, okay, who do I get to sit next to? Thinking maybe I get to sit next to Justice Scalia or someone like that. And I asked the person running the dinner, what table are we at? Who am I seated next to? And let's see. Oh, Secretary Johnson, you're seated in between Mr. Henry Aaron and Ms. Aretha Franklin.
Wow.
Hope you don't mind. Yes, hope you don't mind. So for the next 2 hours, I was like a 14-year-old, too shy to ask for an autograph. But anyway, so I think that what happened yesterday was unprecedented.
Okay.
In that, certainly, I can't remember a former government official having a security clearance revoked because of the things he has said about the incumbent president. And
Fair, yeah, for those reasons, I think it may
For those reasons.
Yeah, right.
And it was sort of similar to the Comey firing in that his staff clearly ginned up a memo for him that, and you can tell it was lawyerly, it was written lawyerly, words like wholly inappropriate, which only lawyers, right, Preet, only lawyers say. And then he goes out and gives this interview and says, I really didn't like this Russia investigation thing. And what first comes to mind is what I tell young lawyers: bad facts make bad law. And it is generally accepted that the president, as commander-in-chief, under his commander-in-chief authority, has almost unfettered discretion to grant or revoke security clearances. And this would make a really interesting lawsuit, in my view. Bad facts make bad law. Presidents have unfettered discretion in terms of security clearances, and up until recently we thought, and who gets admitted into our country. But presidents cannot engage in arbitrary and capricious behavior and an abuse of power. And so I don't know whether John would want to test this in court, but there are limits to what a president can do, depending upon motive. And it has been generally accepted that former heads of intelligence agencies keep their security clearance because of the need to consult. And I'm quite sure that, notwithstanding John's public comments about this president, he probably maintained a pretty good working relationship with the CIA, which the president has effectively severed. So I don't believe that this was an action that was good for national security by any means.
Preet?
Yeah, look, I think it's a terrible thing also. It's good to be here with you guys. And it's part of a pattern with this president in different factors of what he does as commander-in-chief. So the president does have fairly unfettered power in a lot of areas. But what's troubling is, in addition to what the secretary said about pretextual reasons for doing things, whether it's firing Jim Comey or something else, this president, and sort of consistent with the topic of today and what norms are and how you can go against your Department of Justice even without breaking the law, is you consult with folks and you make sure there's a process by which you do things, whether that is the firing of a director of the FBI or the firing of a deputy director of the FBI, where you have tweeted about it and urged that firing such that the process unfolds in a way that Andy McCabe, whether you thought what he did was good or not good, ends up getting his service with the FBI terminated literally one day before his entire pension was supposed to vest. Or,
Preet, can you give it, just on having brought up McCabe, some people in the audience are going to know all about McCabe, and some people will have heard the name referred to, but might not know the details.
Yeah, so Andy McCabe was the deputy director of the FBI under Jim Comey, someone who, depending on your perspective, you thought did a good job, did not do a good job. The Office of the Inspector General did a thorough investigation with respect to some conduct on the part of Andy McCabe, and one of those things was whether or not he was fully forthcoming with the investigators about an interview and information he gave to the press about one of the investigations being done by the FBI, and that became the basis for his termination. And I've said, and I knew Andy McCabe personally, and I did, Russian organized crime cases with him in New York. But the way that it came out, the way, similarly, the pardon of some people has been conducted. The president has unfettered power, basically, with maybe some exceptions, depending on what the conduct was and the intent was, to pardon anyone he wants. So he's pardoned Dinesh D'Souza, who was prosecuted by my office, and some other folks, without consulting with the pardon attorney, without consulting with the judges who oversaw the case, without consulting with the prosecutors to see what the recommendations are. Now, there are processes by which, long-term career, nonpartisan government officials decide things like what the discipline should be, whether the security clearance should be maintained or revoked.
And we know that apparently the DNI Coates was not consulted about the revocation of the John Brennan.
And so the deeper problem, almost separate and apart from the legal question to me, is how many things does this president do and is prepared to do without any discussion with other folks? And it appears overnight, by the way. You have the conflicting rationales. You have the pretextual reason. A funny rationale that was suggested that John Brennan had his security clearance revoked because he engaged in sort of unruly outbursts on social media, which
erratic behavior.
Funny for a lot of reasons.
Right.
And right. I'm like, that sounds familiar. Right. And then overnight, I think there was an article that just came out, I think this morning, in the Wall Street Journal, suggesting that the president had in mind, once again, in engaging in this action, John Brennan's role in the Russia investigation before the administration changed. And Donald Trump also retweeted something that Sean Hannity, his friend, said about who should lose their security clearance, which is based on the people mentioned, those people being involved in the Russia investigation. So this is the second or third time you have sort of a pretense for an action taken against somebody that's retaliatory, some explanation given, and then give it a day, and it ends up being about Russia.
So this is purely educated speculation about what happened. But when the White House first announced that they were revoking the security clearances of that list of people, it was pretty obvious that Rand Paul, who had a meeting with the president just before that announcement by Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and suggested to him, you can revoke the security clearances of people that, are criticizing you, or something along those lines. And so the president says, hey, great idea, and tells Sarah Huckabee Sanders to go out and announce this, and here's the list of people I want you to put on that list. No one bothered to check to see whether, in fact, they had security clearances or not. And so they rolled out with this thing, and I strongly suspect that after that, the staff's probably thinking, okay, he's moved on, maybe we can kind of put this one back in the desk drawer. And then John issued that tweet, which I think came out yesterday or Monday, about Omarosa, and that set him off, and he was back on this, and he tells his White House staff, doesn't tell his DNI or his CI, I'm revoking the clearance, gin up the document, and I'm doing it myself. And so my speculation is that the tweet set him off. I have no idea why the thing is dated July 26th. We should look and see what was happening on July 26th. But, Trevor, you and I, the White House we worked in, we're kind of we're accustomed to a process where this happens. There are endless deputies meetings and principal committee meetings and NSC meetings. There's a process and lots of memos ginned up and everything. And it's so clear to me that he just went out and did this.
Right? Yeah, who knew you could run government this way? Yeah, a lot fewer meetings for me and you.
Right.
Yeah. But in seriousness, let's talk some about that, maybe that, if that's a microcosm, the broader issue, and you've both spoken to it, is that of the relationship, not maybe in part between this White House and the rule of law and national security bureaucracy. So we're talking about the Justice Department, the FBI, Homeland Security, the intelligence community agencies. Not just between this White House and those departments and agencies, but because of his style of governing, between this particular president, between the person of this president and the work being done there. And maybe one place to focus in that. So I'd love for us to talk about that generally, and in the context of that, to talk about what to make of the president's repeated, and I think it is fair to say, wildly unprecedentedly sharp, overheated criticism of the FBI and the Justice Department in particular, with respect to the Mueller probe and how it's been allowed to continue, though it's being led by 13 angry Democrats or whatever it is. 17 angry Democrats, the number goes up.
I think was the new number.
Preet, what do you think? What do you make of all of that?
So this is a question that gets asked every week, and it's a good question to ask, and it's a good issue to be concerned about. We have all these protections in our government for our institutions. So we have a free press, and the First Amendment really does a pretty good job of guaranteeing it. And I haven't been that concerned about the press, notwithstanding the president's attacks and the declarations of fake news. He's undermining people's confidence in the press, but the free press, so far as I can tell, is better here than in Turkey.
That might not
that's
be
the standard now. And the independence of the courts, individual judges get attacked. But, the Constitution allows for federal judges to have life tenure. As I've often said, if you are a federal judge and you piss off the president, you continue to have your job. If you're a U.S. attorney and you piss off the president, you get a podcast. And but one of the and I can go on about some of the institutions, but one of the institutions that it works on the honor system is the law enforcement. The institutions that make up the law enforcement community within the executive branch. And so you get a president who tends to the autocratic and also the whimsical and also to fiat, and he decides he doesn't like somebody. Well, the way this should operate is the way it operated in the Trump organization. I tell somebody, why don't you lay off that guy, Michael Flynn? Or I like somebody, or I don't like somebody, and I say, lock her up. And I say it at rallies, and people cheer to it. Because he doesn't see, and it does not exist sort of structurally in the Constitution necessarily, a separation between politics and law enforcement. So the main reason I'm concerned about it is that of all the things that the president does, some of the other sort of victims of his vitriol and attack, like the press and the judiciary, have fairly decent structural protections. And the folks that do the kind of work that I used to do and that you used to do don't have that. And what you're left with is relying on people of good faith and integrity like Chris Wray, who's the current director of the FBI. I feel somehow we lucked into having a good person at the head of the FBI, as far as I can tell, who I think could say more to sort of defend his troops and to say that we're independent. But so far as I can tell, does not join in the attacks on Mueller, says Mueller is not engaged in a witch hunt. Rod Rosenstein, who's the current Deputy Attorney General, who made some mistakes and was part of writing that pretextual memo that was supposed to justify the firing of Jim Comey. Since that mistake, I think he's righted himself somewhat by first appointing Bob Mueller to investigate Russian interference with the election and other things, but also protecting him. So it's great that you have some bulwarks, but those are individual people whose integrity you're relying on and whose courage you're relying on, as opposed to making sure that the person who's in a position to ruin it, like the president, given his power and authority and discretion, you don't have any check on that. And I think that's cause for great concern.
So I've had limited contact, some contact with Donald Trump. Like you, I think, I was invited to a Trump Tower meeting during the transition. He wanted to hear from the Secretary of Homeland Security, and we spent an hour together, and I met him a couple times during the campaign. But most of my career, I've been a private practice lawyer in New York, and I've met litigation adversaries and even clients who are kind of like Donald Trump. So I feel like I understand the nature of what's going on here, and it's so clear to me that our president views the executive branch of our government as a family business. It should be run like a family business, and everybody in the executive branch works for me. And all day long, he's got people telling him he's commander-in-chief, Mr. President this, Mr. President that. And especially lawyers. He views lawyers as hired guns, as mouthpieces, as people who protect him, and cannot get his head around the notion, which is a fairly sophisticated notion, that you appoint the Attorney General. The Attorney General is your principal legal advisor, but there are certain contexts in which you should not try to tell the Attorney General what to do. And that's kind of a difficult road to navigate, especially if you're not somebody like Barack Obama, and you're not a lawyer. And
could I push back on that a little? It doesn't seem like it was difficult for any other president in the history of the United States to grasp.
Well, we did have somebody named Nixon, who thought he could.
Two.
Right. And there were probably a whole lot of presidents previously who had some really bad instincts, whose instincts were suppressed.
Were reined in, yeah, okay.
Right,
all right.
Which you never heard about. So, the Attorney General, as you know, Trevor, there are contexts in which the president can tell an Attorney General what to do. Like, this particular civil litigation is really important to defend Obamacare, so I want to defend this, or there are contexts where the president may decide, I don't want our government to defend this particular law or something like that.
Like DOMA.
Like DOMA, exactly. What I found so interesting is President Trump's comment a couple months ago, Eric Holder protected Barack Obama.
Right.
Now, you probably had the same reaction I did, which is Barack Obama did not need protecting. He had all of the right instincts. So when the intelligence analyst, when the DNI or the CIA director would brief him on intelligence, he would sit there and he would listen like this. He would never suggest, maybe you ought to see it this way, maybe you ought to say that. He had the instinct to know, I shouldn't tell my intelligence officials what to say, what to do, or how to think. And with law enforcement, likewise, if even I in the Department of Defense, we had military justice, and in Homeland Security knew you don't bring a specific criminal case to the White House. They don't want to hear it. They like, get away from me. And so the bottom line of all of this is that our system, and this is kind of sad news, our system of government depends to a very large degree, and this is how the framers created it, on a rational, mature actor at the top. And we didn't place a lot of restraints on the president because we assumed, like George Washington, that you're going to have a rational, mature actor on the top. And
But
that
they
is
also
being
assumed that
tested
we would
right
have a
now.
strong Congress if we didn't have a mature actor at the top.
Yeah.
We don't seem to have that either.
Right. So we can talk about Congress and what it is not doing, but there are some specific, matters obviously proceeding here, and the Mueller probe, Mueller's work as special counsel is at the core of that. Preet, you've discussed different turns in that at various points in your podcasts. I'm going to try and resist asking each of you to predict where we're going to end up with everything that Mueller's doing. But let me ask instead, a number of cases have already been produced, been generated as a result of the work of Mueller and his colleagues. What's your take on what the Manafort case, the Gates plea, who's the other guy, Papadopoulos, what they tell us about what Mueller and his colleagues are learning, and about what we ought to at least be watching for in the coming months?
Sure. Just one more footnote to
Sure.
what the Secretary and you were talking about a second ago, about what the role of the president should be vis-a-vis law enforcement. There's a memory I have from the time that I was U.S. Attorney that I think about a lot now. And that was an occasion where all the U.S. attorneys had a conference in D.C. Most of the 93 of us were there, and we had an opportunity to take a photograph with the President of the United States, Barack Obama, at the time. We all go over to the East Wing, and we get set up, platforms with the tall people in the back and the shorter people in the front. And the President comes out, Barack Obama, and he gives us a nice little pep talk and says, good to see you, thank you for your service. But then he says one more thing. Long before Donald Trump ever even appeared on the plausible political scene, he said, I hired all of you, and I'm going to thank you for your service, but you don't work for me. You work for the people, and you're supposed to uphold the Constitution, which is self-evident and something that we took for granted then. But the fact that the person who's putatively your boss and at whose will you serve took the time in a group setting to say that in those words is something that's important to remember, and this current president doesn't appreciate that. So what's going on with these cases? I predict that Paul Manafort will be convicted, although
Were you surprised that they rested without putting anything on?
Jay must have a view of this also. There are many cases that I tried and oversaw where the best strategy for the defense was not to put on a case and simply to argue that the cooperating witness is a liar and the whole case is premised on the cooperating witness. And so they didn't meet their burden of proof. Alongside that, you don't get a free ride if you start to put on a case. You put your client on, your client can be decimated, and I don't think Paul Manafort was necessarily going to be a good witness. And then the final point I'll make about that strategy issue is sometimes it doesn't matter. We tried a case against the Senate Majority Leader, Dean Skelos, a couple of years ago, who's a Republican, and he chose not to testify. And then the Supreme Court did its business, and we had to retry the case. The Southern District retried the case this year. Dean Skelos, high-profile person in New York, decided to change his strategy up and did testify. Same case, same facts, got convicted again. So sometimes it doesn't matter. And I think we spend a lot of time sort of talking about the strategies of the lawyers when the evidence speaks, for itself. So, where Manafort is going, I agree with the people who say that, there's probably some intention on the part of the Mueller folks to see if he would flip. They seem to be in the business of flipping people, meaning have that person cooperate with the government, plead guilty, and then testify against people higher up in the food chain. I think the likelihood of that happening now is really low, although technically it can happen after you've testified and after you've been convicted. And remember, he's got another trial coming up in September. I believe that Michael Cohen will be charged. I don't know anything about that case. It's being overseen by my former office, the current United States attorney there, because I don't think they would have engaged in a very high-profile set of searches on his home, on his hotel room, on his safety deposit box, when they know he's the sitting personal lawyer to the President of the United States unless they thought there was a high likelihood they would be able to charge him. But then the last point I'd make about what to make of all this, which is not a legal point, what does it say about Donald Trump? Whether or not any of these people flip and cooperate against Donald Trump in some future hypothetical proceeding, it says something about somebody, and this is true whether you're the governor of a state, the mayor of a city, or the president of a country, or the CEO of a company. If the people you're surrounding yourself with, and you've chosen to make your principal deputies and fixers and counselors, are people like Paul Manafort, Michael Cohen, Roger Stone, Roy Cohn, who, not all of them are convicted yet, but this is a group of people that tell you something about even if he never gets charged, it tells you something about his ethical thinking and about his leadership style.
Right. If Omarosa is as bad as you say, why did you hire her? Right. So,
she said flattering things about me.
Right. So just in case there's any doubt in anybody's mind in this room about this one proposition, the Russian government, at the personal direction of Vladimir Putin, interfered in our democracy in 2016, okay? I hope that's clear among all the very, very intelligent people in this room. Second, notwithstanding what Rudy Giuliani says, that collusion is not a crime, it is a violation of the federal election laws for foreigners, foreign entities, foreign governments to support candidates for U.S. federal elections, and one can engage in a conspiracy to violate the federal election laws, right?
Correct.
Right. And one can engage in a conspiracy to commit computer theft, right?
Correct.
Right. So we got those two things out of the way. So for the longest time, you asked, how do we think it's coming out? For the longest time, I thought that what Mueller was going to ultimately conclude was that there were various different criminal acts committed by those who are now being prosecuted, that the president himself has said and done things that may well constitute obstruction of justice, see all his public remarks, but that when it comes to the original allegation of collusion to commit cyber theft with the Russian government and the Trump campaign, that there would be no there. Recently, I've begun to question my original prediction because, first of all, Mueller's investigation is remarkably disciplined. I've been very, very impressed with the level of detail in the indictments that have been issued. They're doing a tremendous amount of work with no leaks. So we don't know anything about what Mueller's doing, except what we see in a public courtroom. I think Roger Stone is a huge wild card. It's clear that he had contacts with people who may or may not constitute agents of the Russian government. And we know that the Russians were making overtures to the campaign, and we know that the campaign was receptive to those overtures. So I believe that there are facts unknown publicly that will be contained in Mueller's ultimate report that he issues, which may well surprise all of us.
I agree with all that. I also think the question, you didn't ask the question directly, but it's the question that's on a lot of people's minds, on whether or not Bob Mueller will file an indictment, seek an indictment against the sitting president. I don't think he will, no matter what evidence he comes up with. And the reason for that, and people can have an argument about it, and the reason for that is, as Trevor knows, and many of you may know, there's an Office of Legal Counsel opinion that has not been rescinded that basically takes the position that a sitting president cannot be indicted while in office, whether it's for criminal activity during the time he was in office or otherwise. And even though there are arguments to be made, and there are decent arguments to be made, that shouldn't be, that the Constitution doesn't preclude something like that, because of the nature, I think, of, and the stakes of this investigation, the consequences of bringing such a charge, and the general small c conservatism, I think, that Bob Mueller has, the idea that you're going to upend the country and upend an election, duly held election, electoral college popular vote notwithstanding, on the basis of a minority legal view at the Department of Justice, whose guidelines you are supposed to follow as a special prosecutor, I don't see a circumstance in which that could happen. That said, I want to agree with what the Secretary said, but looking forward, that the impressive nature of the indictments, I encourage you to read them, even if you're not lawyers, because they're actually pretty good stories. Get them online and actually read the stories. They're so meticulous and detailed and precise. They leave really not a lot to the imagination, particularly the one about the hacking. They were tracing, minute by minute, the movements of the people in the Russian GRU who are going into computers and exfiltrating information and looking at various things. What that tells me is if and when there's going to be a report that becomes public, either in whole or in part, that it's going to be a bulletproof document that has no opinion, that has fact after fact after fact, because that's the kind of people they are on the special counsel team, and that's the kind of environment that we're in, where everyone likes to spin stuff. I mean, you haven't heard a lot when an indictment comes out. And sometimes people, have their views about them and say, well, this is nonsense and it's fuzzy and it doesn't make sense. Even for people who support the president, when an indictment has come out, there's very little that anybody has said to criticize the indictment based on its own terms. What they have said is, well, the president's not in it, or Ivanka's not in it, or so-and-so is not in it. But they're not saying that the thing that is being brought is anything other than bulletproof. And so anything we see from them, I think, will be the same way.
So let me say I agree with you as to whether Mueller is likely to seek an indictment of a sitting president. I think he will regard himself as bound by the Office of Legal Counsel opinion that says that a president is not indictable while in office. I think the opinion actually concludes the president can't be indicted and prosecuted, and so there's some who tried to make the argument you could seek an indictment and wait to prosecute until after. I doubt that Mueller will try and slice it that thin. It's not impossible. But so I think the question becomes as to the president himself, just as you've both
Except there's
suggested.
a statute of limitations issue.
He'd have to agree to waive somehow.
Yeah.
And so maybe you'd have,
Okay. We're getting into legal weeds
exactly.
Here.
So I think the question, as you both suggested, is what does the final report contain with respect to the person of the president himself, or implications? And there's a prior question about who else might be indicted, and do we think there's substantial risk of people occupying different positions within the West Wing by familial or marital familial relation? And then there's a question of what happens after this report is delivered. The report's delivered presumably to Rosenstein. Presumably it becomes public effectively immediately, whether by leak or intentional release. In one universe, Congress could read this and decide whether any of the claims and supporting evidence in the report provide a basis for opening impeachment proceedings. In another, depending on the timing of this, it could have effects on the midterm elections, depending on when the report comes out. How do you think about all of that? How do you think about the when, and how do you think about the what next? Jay?
So I believe, my prediction is that Mueller will issue a report, a Ken Starr-like report, very, very detailed. It'll be bulletproof. It'll be opinion-free. Won't be editorializing. And it will become public. And then it'll be on the House of Representatives to decide whether or not to move forward with an impeachment proceeding.
Presumably, just in terms of the timing, presumably he would want to try hard and be motivated to try hard to have the timing of the report not affect the outcome of the midterm elections.
Correct.
Which I'm thinking means he either has
Like
until Labor Day,
like very soon,
either until Labor Day or not until the new year.
Well, he hasn't interviewed the
effectively.
president yet, so.
Right.
So
you're thinking
so
no
if
time
I had
soon.
to predict after the midterms, and unfortunately, it will then immediately become a political question. Once you put it to the House of Representatives, which is a political body, it will be politics. And this president and his people have done, in my judgment, a very effective job of politicizing the issue such that you have a very lopsided public opinion among Democrats about Mueller's investigation versus Republicans. And my fear is that his findings will immediately become politicized, heavily politicized, criticized on one side and others on the other side screaming for impeachment. And even if the House votes articles of impeachment, The Senate, I think, requires 2/3, 3/4 to convict,
yeah.
and that's
They won't convict.
That's a supermajority. So it could be 1999 all over again.
Here's another political aspect of it that I really hadn't thought about until this discussion. Because the one thing we haven't mentioned is it depends, the future of impeachment or not depends a little bit on what the makeup of the House is.
Right.
So all these predictions about whether or not the House is going to turn Democratic or not, if the House doesn't change, there's no way in
Right.
any circumstance that any impeachment proceeding will get off the ground. I'm not saying it will necessarily if the Democrats take the House back by a few votes either, and maybe it shouldn't. That's a separate question. But it will never happen if the House doesn't change.
Right.
And
Well,
but the one politicizing sort of political thought is, suppose as people predict, the House does change. And now it looks like there's the opportunity for an impeachment proceeding to happen because people in the House are, the Democratic leadership is calling for it. And then Mueller issues his report. Now, there will be people who will say, I don't think this will be correct, because I think he's just moving on the timeline that makes sense based on the investigation they're pursuing. Oh, he waited until after the election. He saw that the Democrats took back the House. Now impeachment is possible. This won't be correct, but people will say, now he decided to drop this bombshell report. And maybe if the House hadn't changed, he would have moderated his report. I think none of that would be correct, but I think all of that will be said.
If he's worried about that, the time to issue the report is between Election Day and when the new Congress convenes, because the Republicans still have the majority then?
Yeah, but they're not going to be able to delay
Yeah,
it.
but
Right?
there's no time limit on when you have to act on a report.
No, of course not,
Right.
but at least it would seem a little bit less hand in glove or something he might
Yeah.
avoid.
I don't think he's thinking about that. I think probably, I don't know if the Secretary agrees with this. When I did cases, never had a case like this, right? But we had high-profile
Really?
cases. No. Wanted to, maybe. And there's all the speculation in the wind about the timing and when you're going to do it. And the bottom line always was, when we have it, you bring it when you have it. And then if you have it on the eve of an election, then you think about whether or not you wait or you don't wait. But you bring it when you have it. And I think that's how the Mueller people are thinking about it.
So even if the Democrats get the majority of the House, and Jerry Nadler becomes chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and it starts with the House Judiciary
It
Committee.
does. Yeah.
There will be huge political pressure on some Democrats to not go there, on the view that we should not go down the road of impeachment. It will energize his base. Nothing gets done. And, hey, aren't we Democrats about more than this? So that debate will occur. But it should depend on the evidence. It should depend upon what Mueller ultimately finds. And I do believe that there is an unknown factor of evidence out there that the public doesn't know about that could be very, very incriminating. We'll see.
So we're about to open for questions from the floor, and I'll ask whoever has the two standing mics to bring them down. And if you'd like to pose a question to anyone on the panel, please line up behind these standing mics. While the mics are coming forward, let me just I'll ask you to come to one of these. Let me just pose one last question. Another wild card that could arise in all of this, and of course that has been at least arguably signaled by the president with respect to some of the pardons he's already issued, would be to respond to the Manafort case or respond to some other perceived danger by pardoning, either after conviction or even before. Does either of you think that any of the matters connected directly or indirectly to what Bob Mueller and his team are up to might be things that the president will intervene with a pardon?
I think if he had his druthers and acted on his own first impulse, he would have already issued a pardon for everybody that is conceivably involved. But there is someone or something that is acting as a restraining influence on him to date, prevent him from issuing pardons. He's issued pardons in other contexts, sort of acting out. But there's somebody that's kind of holding him back from going there.
I think that's absolutely correct. But what's also correct is what you said a few minutes ago when you were talking about John Brennan losing his security clearance, that he has a reaction, he gets very angry, he's like, I want to do X, and people calm him down. But then there sometimes comes a moment where he gets angry again because something happens, and he's like, I don't care what anybody says, and then you can't hold him back. And I didn't used to think this, but I've come to the view that that Donald Trump is capable of, I'm not sure he's going to do any of these things, is capable of doing any outrageous thing, and maybe even self-damaging thing, maybe even mortally self-damaging thing, that we could come up with if the circumstances are correct, and if he gets angry enough, because I think he has no moderating temperament in himself. And you can imagine a moment, I mean, hypothetically, that he's thinking about doing the pardoning, he's thinking about firing Mueller, he's held back for tactical and strategic and not moral reasons, but tactical reasons. And then there comes a time where literally, and again, I'm just making this up, where his daughter comes, into the crossfire. Not just somebody who was a coffee boy for him, or he claims to be the coffee boy, but his daughter or a family member, someone who's truly close to him. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I can see him erupting in such a way that he takes extreme action. I mean, I never thought that Jim Comey was going to be fired. And I think he got talked down from that multiple times. And then he did, because I think he's motivated by, punitiveness and anger and emotions that he has in the moment.
Okay, we'll start here.
That actually was my question. If Beavis or Butthead Don Jr. is convicted, if he would resign, pardon him, or in other order, and just use that as the excuse to get out. But more seriously, this is so depressing. Who is our hope? What institution is our hope? I mean, the press is trying very hard, but where are the Howard Bakers, if you will, or where is anybody, or what can we look to as a hopeful thing?
Well, they're all retiring, unfortunately.
Or dying.
They're getting out.
Yes.
I asked the same question. They're all retiring or losing in their primary, and there was a time when we had grown-ups in the room who were willing to stand up for what was right for the country as opposed to their party, their immediate political interest. And I believe that much of the Republican Party in Congress has been cowed by his base. They see what happens when you go against Trump. Your support melts away. He tweets in favor of your primary opponent, and you lose. And they all see that. And I've had enough private conversations with Republicans to know that that is largely the reason why we're not seeing someone like a Howard Baker. And we see them, but they're unfortunately, not running for re-election or retiring or dying. Mm-hmm. So I'm depressed about our democracy for this reason.
Can I add, too, that, part of the political space that makes Trump possible, and I guess I kind of think of it that way, as Trump being a symptom of an energy around a particular kind of politics in this country, more effect than cause in that sense. Now, that is thinking of how it is that he came to be in the White House. Then he's the cause of a bunch of bad things once in the White House. But there's a version of it within the Democratic Party, too, on the left, that is deeply skeptical of institutions, the institutions that have tended to be the moderating and mediating sources in our public life. It's in the wing of the party, and it looks more like the cynicism and institutional skepticism within the Trump movement than anything else. And so that is, I don't offer this as a solution, but a further point of concern. It's a reason why some within the Democratic Party potentially wouldn't be reliable defenders of the kind of institutions that I think we'll need to revive and to bring back to strength in order for democracy and the rule of law to be what we want them to be.
Can I say one quick thing?
Please.
Going back to the elections this fall, I think that is an important inflection point. And maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think, even though the House and the Senate are very polarized, the House more so than the Senate, that there are people who are unhappy in the Republican Party, and you're hearing from some of them who are not running again, but some of them who are in office, who, as the Secretary says, don't want to come out against the president because there's nothing for them to gain, and there's a lot of cowardice, not a lot of courage. But if there is, in fact, I think, a wave, right? And some Republicans and conservatives are saying this. They're saying people should vote Democratic, not because they believe in democratic policy, because they want to check. And the aspect of that I think is interesting is now let's say you have a group of people in the House and the Senate who, because of the election, if the president gets pummeled, then they have more reason to come out, more reason to be outspoken. Because if they get shellacked, all these people, all these men and women will lose their chairmanships. And having been a staffer in the Senate for 4 years, when the majority changed, and you see how different it is, what the swing is between being in the majority and not being in the majority, and they've been the majority for a while. They don't like it. And it makes them vulnerable in the next election as well. I'd like to think that some people will come forward and voice their opposition on bad things more. It won't be an act of courage in that case either, but at least it'll be an act.
So in that sense, you're saying that the thing that saves us is electoral outcomes.
Yeah, so the institution you're talking about is the institution of
the people.
Voting in the people.
So I got to say one more thing. There are a number of people who are Republicans who are leaving the Republican Party. And I actually think that's a bad thing to do. People who are true Republicans need to stay in the Republican Party to continue to have influence within the Republican Party. I grew up in the Hudson Valley, which is like 20 miles west of here. And I was a college intern for a wonderful man, first man I worked for in public office, who was a Republican, Hamilton Fish. He's a fourth-generation member of Congress, fourth-generation Republican, who voted for Richard Nixon's impeachment. And notwithstanding what was ever the turmoil going on in the Republican Party, Hamilton Fish and a lot of other Republicans would never have thought of leaving the Republican Party.
Hey, look, I had Jeff Flake on, Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona, who's another example of someone who's choosing not to run again. And I understand that tactical decision as a politician, but I pushed back on him a little bit. I didn't get an answer that was very satisfactory because he models himself on Barry Goldwater. And I think his book it takes the name from Barry Goldwater. And I said, well, if that's your idol, if that's the person you believe in, and I'm not a Goldwaterite, but Barry Goldwater ran on a set of principles that he believed, I don't, but he believed, and he got slaughtered, right, in the election. But people will tell you on the Republican side, who chronicle Republican history, that still became a philosophical foundation and a foundation of ideas that gave rise to Reagan later. So it had some purity to it. You can disagree if you're not, a Reaganite. But the question I have for some of these Republicans is, why not stay and fight and be on the right side of history and lay down what your principles are, and you can become tomorrow's Barry Goldwater if that is what you think is important to do, and they're not doing that.
So we've got 2.5 minutes left, which is time for a quick question and quick answers from us.
I don't know how quick this can be, but
It's got to be.
one could almost visualize the count one in the bill of impeachment that Trump has seriously undermined the law enforcement regime that has arisen by custom and also undermined the rule of law as we know it. By using a tactic he learned from his mentor, Roy Cohn, which is Roy Cohn defeated 3 indictments, as Preet knows, because he attacked the integrity of the prosecutors. Now, Roy Cohn was not then president of the United States, but undoubtedly that tactic has been adopted by Trump. Giuliani said so, and he has created an atmosphere where the Mueller indictment, as meticulously drafted as it's been, it's a terribly impressive document, just as you said, Preet, is called into question. One Trumpist said to me recently when I made that precise point, how do we know the 12 Russians exist? How does he know what happened at 7:02 p.m. in Moscow when they were at the servers? And if we find that he's doing to the law enforcement establishment what he has done to the press by calling everything we read and hear on television fake news, whether he's done such a serious disservice to our democratic institutions that might well be count one in the bill of impeachment.
I'm not sure what the question was.
At the end of it,
I enjoyed your comments.
I guess my question is, how much damage do you think he's done? How much damage do you think he's done?
He's done a lot. Look, he's done a lot of damage. As we've been saying, he's done a lot of damage to law enforcement. He's done a lot of damage to people's trust in law enforcement. But the thing that maybe he's done the most damage to, which is an ephemeral thing that you can't touch, based on your analysis, is he's attacked the truth and the very idea of truth. And so, people have been talking about this Omarosa tape, and you think if it comes out, there are going to be people who will believe that it's made up. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? And if you listen to people like Gary Kasparov, who know a lot about how autocracy works and how propaganda can fuel autocracy, he says, look, it is not the case that people who are autocrats control all media and only get their message out. What they do is, that's important, but what they do more, and what's more important, is to just destroy the idea that there can be objective truth at all. And then in that case, you can pick and choose which things you want your supporters to believe. And so something good comes out, you say, well, that's really great. And something bad comes out, we'll say, look, we can't believe that. And over time, the president has done the most damage by causing lots and lots of people in this country who will not believe a word that comes out of the person I think has more integrity than anyone else I've met in law enforcement, Robert Mueller. And so that's incalculable damage that can be undone only over time.
So we're in overtime here.
We're overtime. I think you could, if you're on another panel, you could offer that thought then, or we can take it up after. Jay, you get the last word.
One last thought. And this is the thing I have trouble getting my head around. When you're president, you're leader of the nation, but you're also the CEO of the executive branch of the U.S. government, and therefore have a responsibility to support and defend the various institutions of the executive branch of the U.S. government, which is why I find it dumbfounding that our president would degrade institutions of his own government, such that when you're picking a jury in a criminal case where the FBI is the investigative agency, it is much easier for the defense to attack the credibility of that FBI witness because of what is in the public space about the FBI and the attacks in a case involving organized crime or terrorism or what have you.
It makes it harder to prosecute MS-13, by the way.
Right.
Ironically.
So I think in both of what Jay and Preet have just said here is the message, to add to the doom and gloom, that the damage that's already been done, set aside whatever further damage might be done, has been done quickly. And whatever the moment is when the corner is turned, it will be not months or years, but decades to rebuild the kinds of norms that the constitutional democracy has relied upon. And we need to imagine a road back, and we need not to be simplistic about the difficulties that we'll face on that road back. I'm sure it'll happen in my children's lifetime, but I'm not sure it'll happen in mine. We need to get to work on it when we can, and I think that what we've heard from Preet and Jay tonight has been fantastically interesting, and I hope you do too.